vision. I've got it on my little.
Yeah, you opened it up on your screen. I had to approve that. I was being recorded.
Okay. Well, I think we can
Here we go.
get started if everybody's got the information to run the meeting. And we're going to close out our week here with testimony from Laura DePietro, who is the Water Quality Division Director at the Agency of Ag, Food and Markets. We've heard from a lot of your colleagues, but and I'm not sure that we won't be hearing from more of them maybe next week, but we're happy to have you with us today.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Just a little background. I've worked for the agency for 19 years this year, which flew by. And I've been in the Water Quality Division the whole time. I originally started in a program that plants trees along the river and then became moved up to the deputy of the division and then the director of the division. So I've got a little history and knowledge of all things. So one of the things I'm most excited about, so to give you some evolution of water quality, let me give you a setup first. So Vermont is a very special state in how we're structured when it comes to regulating farms and regulating water quality. Many states, if I were just to use our acronyms that we use here, right, our DEC, right? Some states have a DEP, but it's the Department of Environmental Conservation here. Other states have different examples of that same acronym. But so there's an agency of ag in every state, and there's a Department of Environmental Conservation in every state for the most part. And usually the Department of Environmental Conservation regulates farms in other states. There's like Maine, as an example, is similar to us, where what DEC normally is doing when it comes to regulating farms is regulating the federal requirements. So EPA is giving DEC the authority to issue permits that EPA normally would issue, Environmental Protection Agency. And that there's only one permit in agriculture that falls under that umbrella. And that's called a concentrated animal feeding operation, or people will call it CAFO. So CAFO only regulates the big farms. It doesn't regulate small farms, and it doesn't regulate non-point source pollution. Non-point source pollution is the idea of you can have a stack over here, and it might be getting kind of like maybe there somehow, but you don't see a path. And so it's too close, and it's probably getting there, but you can't really say it's getting there and I'm watching it, right? So it gets there, but it's not through a point source. And so on the federal level, they don't really regulate in that space, in non-point source space. They regulate in point source. So if they see, a pipe is a very easy one with a discharge coming out of it, but also like a nice carved channel or a ditch that has waste getting to a river or a lake. So in other states, my assessment a few years ago is more than half of the states in the United States did not have any non-point source regulations at all. But Vermont, we do. And what happened in Vermont is that the EPA delegates their permit, that CAFO permit I was saying, which is a point source permit, to DEC. Then in the statute, which you all are responsible to work with, it tells the Agency of Ag and the Agency of Natural Resources, which is where the DEC is housed, to coordinate and cooperate on the non-point source work. So the Agency of Agriculture does all the non-point source work in the state of Vermont, and the Department of Environmental Conservation does all the point source work. There's an MOU between us that outlines how we do that, which is required by statute. And like I said, Maine is another state that has that. It's a very uncommon thing, but it has worked, in my opinion. Again, I've been here for a number of years. It has worked very effectively in the fact that the Agency of Ag is understanding of what farms are doing, and we're able to prevent things, which is what non-point source pollution basically does. It gets there and holds the farmer accountable before there's a water quality issue. There has to be a risk, obviously, it would be a violation, but it can hold them accountable. If our agency, part of this MOU, comes up to a discharge that we see looks like it's more like a point source discharge, we have to give that to ANR, right? Because they're responsible to regulate those, or else EPA will not be happy with them. So we send those over to ANR. We call those referrals. And I think it's worked really well because I haven't met a single farm that's the same as another farm yet. Every single fix is different, and the solutions are not run of the mill. I can tell you, ourselves and USDA, because the United States Department of Ag works with farms too to do water quality conservation practices. We have both hired outside engineering firms over the years, and we have a retainer contract, right, where we can pull in from like a private consulting firm if we need to. Many times those folks are just not well equipped to understand or to work with farms. They're usually trained in civil building or, other infrastructures like transportation infrastructure. And manure is corrosive to equipment so understanding how to engineer something that's going to be long lasting and work for the farm. It takes a different type of mindset. We have to train our engineers to become sort of agricultural engineers because most people come as a civil engineer versus an ag engineer. So it's really useful that the agency of ag can come up to a farm, identify a violation, and then provide them with the technical assistance. We have engineers on staff to go fix that problem because, again, we just understand it better. And so there's been, and I'll show you some enforcement data in a minute, but there's controversy over the years. It's been going on since before I worked here of the Agency of Ag should not be regulating farms, that it should be over at the Department of Environmental Conservation. At this point, that has come up, I think, every year I've been here. And today, what I'm about to show you is our effort to really just be super transparent so that you all, as the public legislators, can see it. Because there's this false sense, I think, that we're hiding something or doing something. So we're trying to be very open-ended here.
I'm sorry, you're moving kind of fast. So going back to your example of non-point source, you mentioned a stack manure.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Okay, and it's the Ag Department or the Agency of Agriculture that identifies non-point sources? Mm-hmm. But you would like to, or maybe it makes more sense for it to be in the DEC.
Well, no, so what I was trying to lay out is that non-point source is Agency of Agriculture.
Yeah.
And point source is Department of Environmental Conservation. That's how Vermont's structured.
Right.
And I think it works really well.
Oh, that works well. Okay.
I think so, yeah. Other states either don't have anything that we regulate at all. So we have no regulations in the non-point source world. Or if they do, they might all be in the DEC so that the DEC does point source and non-point source.
Gotcha.
So there's just different structures that exist out there.
John.
Do we have any CAFOs in Vermont, like LFOs? Are they considered CAFOs?
Well, so what we did in the Agency of Agriculture is we created a medium farm. So CAFO, I'm gonna get you all trained by acronyms at the end. The concentrated animal feeding operation is a permit for larger farms. There are two kinds. There are medium and large sizes. And so the Agency of Agriculture, we have two permits that we call medium farm operation permits, so MFO, and then large farm operation permits, LFO. So these two permits exist. And there is a CAFO permit, but essentially there are no CAFO permits issued to date at two farms. So CAFO is a permit that exists at ANR or DEC. I'll use those interchangeably, and I'm sorry, but they're both the same thing. So that's why I accidentally do it all the time. But CAFO is over at ANR and they have a draft permit. MFO and LFO are ag, and we have those and we have, I think 39, don't quote me for sure, but I think 39 LFOs and I think it's 99 MFOs.
And is the distinction between a large farm and a CAFO the number of animals?
Well, so what we've done in Vermont, the thresholds do exist. Our thresholds for animal numbers are exactly the same as what EPA sets out, which is that CAFO standard. So a medium farm, if we're just talking dairy, because it's our predominant form of agriculture that we usually regulate in this space, a medium farm is 200 mature dairy cows to 699 mature dairy cows. And then a large one is 700 and there's no limit to the top. So it's all the intention, and our MOU says that we will create these MFO and LFO and they will meet the requirements of the CAFO. So in essence, if you meet the terms, and they could be equal to or better, right? If you meet the terms of the Agency of Ag permits, in theory, you should never need a CAFO permit. So that's how it's operated. The LFO was first drafted in 1999. And the medium farm one was drafted in 2006.
Okay, so a little clarification, because I thought I knew what CAFO meant. But now after hearing this, it seems to be more tied to farm size or animal population. I thought that it meant how animals are kept in confinement?
So the idea is that you're not wrong about
Okay.
there's multiple pieces, right? It's not just one thing, but the idea in a simple definition of what is a CAFO is animals that at least for 45 days are confined together, right? Into this space where so basically it's concentrating animals and having, to deal with the waste that's generated essentially from all of those animals. So if there's a definition and they have to be, confined for at least more than 45 days in an annual period.
So if I had, say, 600 beef cattle in a grazing operation and they're never in a barn or a building, is it still a CAFO?
Yes, it would be, potentially,
Oh,
depending.
that's
So,
strange.
depending. So there's the other piece that and we could get way down this path, and you might want to bring in A&R because the CAFO is their permit, right? But I can give you what at least my understanding is of it. You need it, some states operate states that are not like ours, where they don't have a medium or a large farm otherwise permit, and they only have a CAFO permit. They will issue those permits, for instance, to large farms, as an example. There is some case law that when EPA tried to issue it to medium farms for a potential to discharge, because the permit is about letting a discharge occur. And so there was a lawsuit and it basically they were told you can't make someone get a permit if they're not discharging. So if they have a potential to discharge, that's not enough. And so there's some funky space
Yeah, but with the non-point source, it's still a discharge, hence a CAFO.
No, well,
No.
let me, sorry, I know. It's not a point source discharge. So CAFO is point source.
Right,
Right. So and non-point source discharges are not point source discharges.
right. But if you had 600 beef cattle in pasture, that would be non-point source.
So what I was going to say is the animal numbers matter, and the potential for a discharge matters, and the situation matters in terms of what's going on. So different states do it differently. So I don't want to answer it across the board because, again, some states have created that as their state law to say that you will get a permit. But in Vermont, you have to have a discharge. You could either voluntarily do it. You could say, I want one without, on your own. So you could absolutely do that. Or you have to have a discharge and then you would get a permit.
Okay.
It's okay. We can work on it
Yeah,
over
that's
time.
Representative O'Brien.
So any Vermont LFO or MFO, size operation ever decided to go with a CAFO and an EPA permit instead of using?
Not to date, no.
Yeah, because you're probably much friendlier and easier to deal with.
Some may agree with you, some may not agree with you. I'm not sure about that. So let's see, where to go from here. One of the things, so just to talk a little more about this coordination. So we have this MOU that we coordinate. And so like little things, right? Like yesterday I was at a meeting, actually it was 2 days ago now, sorry. A quarterly meeting with the Attorney General's office, the Agency of Ag and DEC, right? So we have these quarterly meetings where we talk about cases that are at the Attorney General's office. We also talk about cases that DEC is taking, and then Ag's cases as well. So we do that coordination. Every single Friday, the person who does enforcement in our agency meets with the person who does the CAFO program over at A&R, and we talk about everything that's going on. Because one of the things we do, again, if we ever see something that might be a discharge, we have to give it to A&R. So all of those cases go over to that person, that CAFO person. And then every Friday, we just kind of check in and say, like, did you find anything? Do you want to give it back? Right? Because if they decide it's not a discharge, a point source discharge, I'll try and use complete phrasing, then it comes back to us, right?
Sorry, you can go on. I was just going to ask for an example of something that you might come across where you might say, this might be a discharge and hand it off.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the most common ones that comes up is if you've ever been to Addison County, it's about one of the flattest places in Vermont. And the ditches there go on for over a mile, right? So that is one thing. We make sure people have good boots because you're going to spend some time doing some hiking. And so while a production area may be way over here and we might see something getting to the ditch there, that ditch goes for a mile and it may bend and turn and 5 other ditches may intercede with it. And It may flatten completely out. That's one thing in Addison County. It happens all the time. It's like the ditch just literally disappears. And then if you just keep walking, obviously the landscape will drop at some point and it'll start back up. And so it was in a ditch up here. We may not be able to show that it got anywhere, but we would let DEC decide that, right? In many instances. So landscape is funny, and defining point and non-point source is very difficult to do because something can start as a point source and you can have photos that look like, oh my gosh, that's the worst. Why isn't that farm, being regulated as a CAPO? They can't do that. But then if you pan out and look, you see you can't prove that it's a discharge and actually getting into surface water. So.
On this issue, I'd like a clarification. Dealt with point source and non-point source for many years in forestry, but does it need to reach a waterway or a wetland, meaning a perennial stream, an intermittent stream, obvious waterway or a water body? Those are what I know we're trying to protect, but also they could impact a wetland. It does not have how do they affect what impact on wetlands?
I'm going to answer this, but I'm going to be very clear that the decision of what is a point source discharge is ANR's decision, right? Ag doesn't get to make those decisions. But I can tell you from my knowledge of how everything works that if it's surface water, right? If it's water and you can see it's water in a wetland, it's surface water, definition of surface water.
Surface water.
Yeah, but there are definitely wetlands that are completely dry,
Oh, yeah,
right?
no.
And so
Vernal pools.
it may not look like a wetland. And so that's where I think, ANR will navigate that and interpret it. But I can tell you, from our perspective, we may not have any knowledge that there's a wetland there at all, right? Likely not mapped or whatever, right? Because it's dry. And so if we see waste, like that flattened out example I gave, right? If the ditch literally just kind of settled, Addison County soils are heavy soils, right? The heavy, heavy clays. And so the fact that it goes there, there's no standing water there, we would not likely refer that if it just dead ends and it's just a flat area. If it were standing with catskills and, had evidence that it likely could have water in it, but just, and you can see maybe there's mud, and that would be different, right? That would be this is a potential that it could be a discharge. So it depends on the evidence and the information and everything you look at.
So the answer is yes, it's a discharge if it discharges into water.
That's the absolute, yeah. But then
Okay.
he's pointing out there's some gray areas.
There's gray,
Got it.
that's all I'm saying.
Yeah,
Mhm, yeah. And that's what comes up is all those gray areas are exactly what everyone gets frustrated about. And so we do our best as an agency to say when we see it and it looks pretty obvious that, the standing water, the evidence of things, we will send it over to the Agency of Natural Resources to decide. If we see it and it's dry and there's not really evidence of something, we might just enforce on it and take it and make sure we deal with it to say, look, you've got a risk here because if Noah's Ark does come, it could go and bypass and jump over that area and get down that hill and go to that ditch, right? So, and you're not managing it, right? Your waste need to be kept up here, not even leaving that spot.
okay, so if you're a medium or large farm, you automatically have a discharge. But what if there's no body of water for it to go into?
Well, so that first statement is
Is
not
wrong.
true, yeah.
Okay.
That's what we do is we tell you cannot do that. So nobody's allowed to have a
Right.
discharge.
Oh, yes, okay.
The discharge is a waste pollutant getting to water, right?
Okay.
Nobody, not allowed. But what I did, and probably why I'm confusing you, is I said that the CAFO permit is a permit to discharge.
Right,
And what that standard is, to explain, I know it's, so Irene, right, when Tropical Storm Irene came through, that was a storm that was bigger than the standard. This discharge standard that's in that CAFO permit is a 25-year, 24-hour storm event. So when the big storm comes and a huge amount of rain, you are expected to have all your infrastructure be able to handle a storm that's as big as a 25-year, 24-hour storm. I can't remember how big Irene was, but I feel like they said at some point it was almost a 500-year event. So it was a big
Wow.
storm. So they said basically, and we didn't have any permits in Vermont at the time, but I got emails from New York that said if you're a CAFO, because they have CAFOs over there, and you have an overtopping of your manure pit or, your silage containment system is able to have it,
overtopping, okay.
right? So you have something that happens that waste gets to water it's so long as you can show that you had managed everything the way it was supposed to be managed, right? You've done all your housekeeping, and your infrastructure was designed, which you wouldn't have gotten a permit in the first place. That's one of the requirements of getting a permit is it's designed to meet that 25-year, 24-hour storm event. If you have a discharge during that Irene, that's a permittable discharge. So it was allowed, right? Because you're basically the regular storms, you should have no discharge. But when the big one comes and it's exceeding, because like it would be the size of a Walmart parking lot, the retention basin you would need, right, to make sure that you hold everything for some of these really, really large storms. And so they don't expect farms to build those across the board everywhere because those storms are so rare.
As we're seeing 100-year storms happen every few years, you know, as these storm periods are shrinking, is there any attention being paid to the need to either grow the basin or grow the size of storm that the permit is for?
Yeah, so the engineering standards, we use the USDA. So the United States Department of Agriculture has multiple branches of it. The one we most commonly work with is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, so NRCS. So if I often will say just USDA, what I mean is USDA NRCS. They have engineering, they set the standards. So the federal government sets standards for if you're going to build a manure waste storage, these are the rainfall standards, these are the engineering, structural standards. So we utilize all of that. And so they do keep up to date with that, and then we work with that. But in the standard, EPA uses and has set forth, this is getting really technical, but the TP40 standard. And that is a standard that has been around for a very, very long time. I think since the 1960s or before. So it hasn't evolved. But there is newer data that is coming out, Atlas 14, and so the USDA has adapted to the Atlas 14. So while our engineering that's going on now on farms is meeting the newer standards, those farms that were essentially, I'll call it grandfathered, right, and are meeting the federal standard, those are still operating under that. But again, ag, it doesn't much matter. You can't have a discharge, right? So, and granted, like, I'll be honest, right, when Irene comes through, we weren't running around looking for farms because even though there's not a CAFO permit, like if there was something going wrong in a discharge, we weren't out there in the storm trying to figure out who was discharging.
But there might be the need, like if the permit is set up to say, oh, well, of course, a 500-year storm comes along, we're not going to hold you accountable as long as but if a 500-year storm becomes a much more frequent event, then it would have to evolve to.
Well, let me give you some more of the safety precautions that exist. Because again, those storm events would have been permittable, so they wouldn't have been a violation.
Right.
And Irene.
So, but that's the point I'm trying to make is that.
We have the safety valve,
Okay.
right? So we have a winter spreading ban in Vermont, and it's in the Agency of Ag regulations. So you're not supposed to be spreading any agricultural waste out in the wintertime between December 15th and April 1st. And you can remember because that's April Fool's Day, and it's not a joke. So during that time period, we do have the ability to issue exemptions, and we do those only on an emergency basis. And so we can talk about that later. But in essence, that is 106 days, right, from one to the other. And the standard that we make people have for storage is 180 days. So, we make them have 74 more days of storage of waste generation from a farm so that there's that buffer. So even if a big storm did come, that's all built, and that 180 days includes, that's where that 25-year, 24-hour storm event is built into that. Plus any solids that accumulate in the bottom of the pit is built into that. Plus another 12 inches of freeboard, which is just space in the pit, is also, actually it's 18 inches, is built into that. And so not only is there extra days, there's an extra 12, an extra foot to 18 inches, depending on the storage type. And if your solids weren't accumulating in the bottom, we did add extra space to accumulate the solids. So the idea is like, you shouldn't be overtopping, even if a bigger storm came.
I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Representative Rice, but is the question partly what was once considered a 100-year storm or a 500-year storm now might be a 50-year storm or a 250-year storm? And you know, so changing conditions mean that those storms that really only did, that the likelihood was really only 1 in 100. Now the likelihood is 1 in something else, or something smaller.
One thing I'm not is a climatologist. And I don't know if they've actually, I don't think anyone's actually reset the standards of what is what. But I could be wrong there. But in essence, we're seeing more intensity in some instances. And I know Josh Faulkner at UVM has done some work that suggests that, you know, our rainfall has increased several inches over the last number of years. And so we are aware that there is this potential, whether it's long-term or whether it's just short-term, and how much it is in the bigger scale of things, right? It will, someday it'll all be clear what the history looks like going backwards. But, you know, there does seem to be this increase. And so, but again, I think, you know, regulating the farms the way that we do and watching them, I don't think it has necessarily impacted anything that's, you know, been designed already because of all the safety valves that have already been put in place. But again, anything new being designed is being designed under newer standards. So that do take into account the intensity of rainfall. And so they basically, it just increases the storage capacity and the depth of the rainfall that would be needed to be captured.
But there's no mechanism for, once a permit is granted, it is forever. There's no mechanism for reviewing or going back and, or, you know, as standards change, saying, well, you're actually going to have to bring this up to these standards in this period of time, or.
Well, if there was a single permit that we had that is still the same as the permit that it started, I'd be shocked. Because farms evolve. And one thing that happens, so the bigger the farm, the more likelihood they have multiple storages, right? And so as things evolve and things change, they're getting additional storages, and those storages have to be at the different standard. And so it'll look at, when we do this, it's a manure wastewater handling plan, and it looks across the storage across all the farm. The other thing is, as another safety valve, is the USDA and us usually build 240-day storages. So building bigger than what is the 180 standard. In essence, like, even though this storage may be this big, you have all these other storages that are part of the farm, and you are expected to transfer the manure.
I only ask because you mentioned farms being grandfathered in.
Maybe that's confusing to you. Like, we don't make them fix that one storage that is, say there's a storage at a farm that is met the original standard. It's the current standard still, for the regulatory standard, not the technical standard. And so if we would expect them to move that manure versus make that pit bigger, if that makes sense. We would work on a different pit if it made sense on the farm. If they need to upgrade that one, we'll upgrade that one as well. But if it makes sense strategically because they bought another farm and that farm needs a new storage, like, let's do that one to meet the overhaul and transfer over. So again, I think between the 240, the additional multiple feet in a pit, and the additional days that are required, we haven't seen this be an issue. The only time we see this, and even I wouldn't say I see it as an issue, but we see where people don't have the 180 days technically on paper, but they don't necessarily, doesn't mean they're discharging or having an issue, because it's only 106 days they can't spread, right? So we enforce on those people and tell them they need to get 180 days of storage. But yeah, and all of this rainfall data is relatively new, that it's changed. So we've talked about, like, over time, you don't want to change mid-cycle, or even, like, you can't drop a standard and say everything else is now non-compliant, right? So you have to build it out, right? And so the medium farm permit is good for 5 years, and every 5 years we have to renew it. The large farm permit, most people go 3 or 4 years before they need an amendment, right? So they're pretty commonly being amended. But yeah, I think you have to set it up that the next time, which we're doing medium farm this year, that you would set up that a heads up that future years are going to be like that. So that way you can work towards compliance. So that way not everyone is non-compliant on day one.
I think before Representative Templeman asks this question, I just want to make sure we haven't gone too far afield on an important topic, but want to just check in and see whether, in terms of covering what you had hoped to cover this afternoon, that we're not too far off track there.
The more you get educated in the depth you need, I'm happy to provide. So this is my job. So wherever you need to go, but I will just jump and I will move to this. So what we were just talking about was our best management practice program. That's where we help farms cost share for these storages and these structures. And that's where we use the USDA standards to develop projects. So We use, a lot of it's usually capital money. Some ARPA money has definitely come in the last couple of years to do work there. But that is our brick and mortar program. The next one on that list is a capital equipment assistance program. So that's a program where, like, basically BMP is in the production area, or where all the buildings and animals are on the farm. And SEEP is typically out in the field, right? So it's the steel in the field. And so a good example that makes sense in this program is people can spread manure the old fashioned way, right? Which leaves the manure potentially on the ground, and then you have to come back with a second piece of equipment and till it in. So you've got 2 passes, and there's climate conversations you can have with that, but there's also nutrient loss with the manure volatilizing and losing nitrogen. So for water quality, a good practice is to just inject it right in the ground. So 1 pass, it's got like a knife and a tube. And so instead of just spraying it on the ground, it sprays it, about this far under the ground, and it reduces the odor, because the odor that you're smelling when you smell manure being applied is nutrients actually being lost. So that's the kind of thing where, farmers can certainly, it's not illegal by any stretch to just spread manure, right? But if you want to do it better, we have programs to help you do it better for those reasons. So these are, above and beyond normal agricultural practices to try and reduce water quality issues. Again, that's another capital program. The third capital program is the Conservation Reserve Program, Enhancement Reserve Program. That is the trees on the streams, basically, or even grass strips along streams and ditches. And that is a 4-agency federal and state government partnership where the state only pays 20% of the cost of all of the program, and the federal government pays the other 80%. And it's actually, it gives landowners rental rates over years. So over 15 years, a landowner can get paid a rental rate to put their land next to a stream or river into this program.
Representative Dumpling.
I'm sorry. So I'm trying to weed out the assumptions here because it feels like there's a lot of them as far as looking at farming as a monolith, like, oh, you're a dairy farmer, so you must have a manure pit. That's the assumption. So what if there's a model that doesn't fit into these, but it's a larger or a medium size, like, for example, I mentioned before, a 500 numbered herd of beef cattle who never make it into a barn. They're Scottish Highland, and they won't even go into a structure, right? They'll fight you, right? Mm-hmm. So they're always, say they're in a rotational grazing pattern, even during the winter. But because it's a CAFO, it's a discharge.
Not Vermont. That's what I'm saying. In Vermont, we don't have any CAFOs.
Oh.
Right?
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so in other states, sometimes the CAFO is the only permit they have, and they've agreed through their whole government structure that that is the permit they'll issue.
Okay.
In Vermont, we have a permit that exists.
Okay.
At DEC.
Yes.
But they haven't issued it to any farm. So there isn't a permit on any farm in Vermont. But there are medium and large farm permits on anyone who meets the size threshold. It has nothing to do with whether you discharge or not. If you meet that size threshold, that's the trigger for that permit to say, like, you are required to go get that permit from the Agency of Ag if you have 600 cows. You would need a medium farm permit.
Well, I would love to see a diagram of all of this because I'm really lost. And it's not your fault. It's complicated stuff.
Yeah. Well, and so to the point of those that don't need the same infrastructure, right, if you're outside. So we do also have our pasture and surface water fencing program, helps pay for infrastructure for setting up a grazing system. We don't have anyone on staff that's like a grazing specialist at the Agency of Agriculture. We use like the University of Vermont Extension and folks like that to work with. There's private consultants out there too, but we will work with them and set up the whole infrastructure and help cost share for the fence. If stream crossings are really where most of the cost comes in for some of those, and watering tubs and getting pumps to get the stuff everywhere. So, and then, so FAP, this one, Farm Agronomic Practice Program, that is our big agronomic practice. So like cover cropping, right? You probably have all seen green fields in the winter. That program helps support some of that. And to be clear, all of these programs, not one of them pays 100%. Well, let me take that back. CREP is the only one where you could, and it's because the federal government and the state are joining together, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife comes in to pay that last 10% when someone's doing a a tree project only. So only for tree projects is there this possibility that someone could get 100% here. But otherwise, most of these are like 80 or 90% paid, and then the farmer is responsible for the remainder of it.
Can I ask, are these programs that are all funded, like base funding, and they're
So let me show you.
oversubscribed, or are they?
Well, so this is, you have this and you can go through it. This is the first year we've ever done this, right? Normally we give you a big paper report. We still did, we gave you a paper report. But we wanted stuff to be accessible to everyone, right? Because we have all this data and we now have databases, like everything, ever since X 64 2015, we finally got people, right? We used to have 4 people that did all this work. And now, I think I have 11. So we're able to do stuff, which is really helpful. But so one thing you can look at here is investment, right? And I'll use this just to kind of jump through. If you see, these are the same, can you see my picture? I can. These are the same acronyms. So these are the programs, right? So you can see how much money we're investing in which program area. You can see BMP, that's the one we were most of the time, like that's the biggest chunk of money that we put out the door. But you can also see by the source of fund, right? So capital fund, you can see, again, it makes sense that it's the biggest source because our program that we spend the most on is from mostly capital, right? BMP is either capital or as of late ARPA. But then there's a clean water fund, right? So a lot of you have probably read about or know about that. So that's, what bottle deposits and things like that, or property transfer tax. So the clean water fund is also a significant portion of our budget. We use that money typically to do like the agronomic practices, right? The things that are not capital. And then here you have our federal match. So the USDA and us will match on that BMP program. They will typically pay up to like 75%, and then we'll pay up to the 90 from the 75. It has been interesting with COVID and price changes. We've actually been in a space where they do everything and they set their prices a year in advance. And so when the time comes that everything's done, the farmer thought they were getting 75%, but they really got 50, right? Or something to that effect. And so we can come in and help make up that differential as well when prices really didn't reflect what it should have been. But we do it all based on invoices and we scope every invoice. And then general fund is this light blue, right? So 4% is general fund grants that we put out. We get money from the Lake Champlain Basin Program. That goes through DEC and then comes to the Agency of Agriculture. And that mostly supports engineering and the CREP work that we do. Local match is mostly farmers matching to these grants. And then there's we have a separate grant with USDA that they gave us money directly to run a program to pay for when someone can demonstrate they've got phosphorus reductions above what the Lake Champlain phosphorus. So Lake Champlain phosphorus TMDL said that, we had to reduce things by at least 40%. And so if you're over that, we applied it to the whole state. If you're over that, you could get paid for any reductions you have over 40% reductions.
So I'm going to turn here in a second, but just wanted to ask now that we're here and now that I've seen you navigate to this page, that's helpful to know that this is a bigger tool. So the 67 million, just because that's a big number at the top, that's total investment to date over the time period.
The time period that's shown here, yep.
And are there's quite a bit of variation in the columns and from year to year. Is there, I guess, so started out with the question was, is there enough funding so that anybody who's looking for assistance in one of these programs qualifies, or are they competitive or first come, first serve?
They're all competitive.
Yeah.
And things like what watershed are you in help get you different ranking points because, like, for instance, we do have to and it's in statute, if you read our statute, first priority is Lake Champlain. Next priority is usually Memphremagog, or is it Connecticut, and then Memphremagog, and then Hudson. But it depends on the program too. Some programs have different rates. But then, we also put if you're under enforcement, right? If you have an actual issue that needs a resolution quick, then you do get a higher point system for that.
Representative O'Brien had a question. We got a couple questions over here, and then we'll get over here.
Just a quick one, Laura. With the PES payments, we've heard about, was it CSP, the And where does that fit in this acronym soup?
It is not here because that's new and that'll be in the next fiscal year,
Okay.
right? Because that hasn't even, that was just finished, right? They just finished up their meetings and they'll do that. But it's in essence, and we've got to decide, frankly, how we're going to do it. We might just drop it into one of these programs like FAP, but make it a new payment type, right? That we would do within our existing infrastructure. But we've got to navigate that. So admittedly, now that the group has figured out what they want. But one of the things with this tool on all these pages, you can click around. So, right, you could be like, well, what if I just wanted to look at 2021, right? What would that look like? And you could see some of that stuff change. You know, this doesn't need to change because you can look right here and see that that's what 21 is. But this is now looking at just 2021, you know, $10 million. So you can poke around and just, you know, look at things in the lenses, you know, back to 2016, you can see we only had $3 million. So, you know, you can see how much this, before the Act 64, the Vermont Clean Water Act, we were down, you know, at this very low level. And ever since then, it's just gone really ramped up and has done a lot in terms of implementation on farms. So if you want to undo something, you unclick it again and it'll come off. So we did create, because this is a new tool that is new to all of us, but there is.
Just before you leave the stage, Representative Rice, did you have a question about?
Yeah, one is just a quick clarifying about something on that page, which is on the total investment by region.
Yeah.
What is a statewide?
So this is
Project.
statewide.
But in that circle, there's 14%, the orange is labeled statewide, as opposed to Champlain Basin.
Oh, here it is. You're down here.
Yeah.
So one of the things we do, I don't know, I haven't watched and kept track, I'm sorry, of every single entity you've met with, but like the UVM Extension, I've mentioned their name. The Vermont Conservation Districts is another entity.
So
that
this
we
is
do a lot of
this is
grants.
great, because my second question is how do these interface with the conservation district programs?
Yeah, so they are statewide operating groups as two examples, right? And they are two that we commonly will work with. When we give them a grant, right, because this money is also going out to them. It's either going to farmers or it's going to groups like that, right? That's where these monies all go. And we don't want to stick their money and assume it went to a certain watershed, right? So we give them that money, they have a statewide charge. So that statewide means that's money that has gone to an entity that works statewide. if that makes sense.
So for instance, tree planting that's done by conservation districts is represented in these numbers.
Well, I don't want to
Okay.
confuse you anymore, it's so tough. The statewide tree planting for the district is through A&R.
Okay.
Um, Ag doesn't necessarily, I don't think we have for years, because they have a Trees for Streams program, and that used to come along, I mean, it started decades ago. We do the CREP program, that tree buffer. And so in between, we're not running a Trees for Stream because that's just historically been done somewhere else, so.
The Representative Lipsky has a question, but I'm just going to jump in here again. You mentioned that the Champlain Basin had got, well, we can see there on the chart that it has the larger part of the circle, investment by region. Did you say a moment ago that it gets priority? And is that because of federal?
Because of state statute
State statute.
directing us that that's a priority location to first fund.
And is that because of the EPA requirement?
And there's since I've been here.
Oh, okay, so it predates anything.
And I think it was just, predating because the pollution issues have been highlighted.
Been there for a
there.
while, okay.
Yeah.
Representative.
Yeah, it's sort of a bit of a follow on your question, but the map that got my attention the most was total investment by tactical basin.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just Franklin and Orleans County, it was really that Missisquoi River watershed basin. And then it wasn't Addison County, but it really starts where Representative Rice is on the Bennington County, really the Otter Creek through Rutland County into Addison County watershed, which also has challenges and is discharging into the Champlain, Lake Champlain. So those tactical areas are pretty, clear that they're a huge part of the
Yeah.
challenge that we're facing.
If you've looked at the census data or just county maps of where agriculture is in the state, it's in Franklin County, Orleans County, Addison, and then Rutland, I think is maybe the next. And if you look at the watersheds, you're right, like Missisquoi, this is Lake Memphremagog, and then the Otter Creek are the predominant watersheds that fall underneath that ag land. And then there's another layer of just priority as well for places like Missisquoi and Otter Creek. Because interestingly, so the Lake Champlain phosphorus TMDL was redone a couple of years ago. And that all started because the environmental organizations told EPA, you shouldn't have approved the first TMDL. So the first TMDL has been in place for quite a while. I don't know how long it goes back, but that could be, part of that conversation that you asked your previous question. But in essence, when they did the work to revise the TMDL, what they came up with, so Missisquoi and Otter Creek basins, or South Lake basins, which are sort of both of these basins in some regard that are here. The simplest way I like to explain it is Missisquoi Bay, right? It's very shallow. I think the deepest part is like 12 feet deep, but predominantly like 4 feet deep. So it's like this shallow basin. And historically, lots of stuff has gone in it, right? Phosphorus doesn't just magically disappear. It's going to stay right there. And if you get these conditions, right, where it warms up and all the good things happen, you're going to get algae blooms. And so the only way to get rid of it is to essentially either, biologically have it get taken up by things that then leave the watershed somehow, right? And so there is drainage that's occurring. The lake is constantly moving, and there is loss through the St. Lawrence Seaway to the north. But that takes a while, right? And so in order to deal with meeting the water quality standard in Missisquoi Bay, you have to starve the bay. And so in order to starve it, basically agriculture has to reduce more than agriculture contributes. So even though agriculture only contributes and I'm throwing numbers out, but 50% of the pollution that comes from the watershed, they have to get rid of, I think it's 69% of the pollution leaving the watershed. So they have to go negative.
Agriculture has to do that.
Mm-hmm. And the way that the TMDLs always work, everything else is very measurable, but agriculture is moderately measurable. Forestry is in the same boat as us too. We talked a little bit about that. They also have to go negative and, starve themselves, go on a starvation diet to get to the space where they are polluting less than they could, so it's going to take a fair amount of resources to put at farms, which is also the founding of if you read the ag statute, it says that the cost of this stuff shall be borne by the public, not by farmers. And I think that fits this really well when I realize it's wow, it's not just they have to take even what society, they're trying to deal with society's pollution and their own pollution because they have to take an additional amount off than would normally just be theirs in order to meet the standard. So that's how TMDLs are done.
No, it's really fascinating. Mr. Chairman, I hate to leave in the middle of this absolute rigmarole. It is, and I'm not being.
I appreciate your eagerness.
Because
If you need to leave,
I have.
yep, thank you for
Because I have
checking.
a daylight thing and I'm closing to a gate that I have to.
better go do that, yeah.
It's closed on the weekend, which is normal.
Were there other hands up here? I've lost track of.
I just had a quick one.
Okay, go ahead, John.
So how do you actually go negative?
You do more practices than what you are doing, right? So we could go into some weeks here, but
Like RAPs, BMPs, right? You have BMPs and RAPs farms that sort of target numbers, right? So in this case, to meet these TMDLs, they actually have to even.
yeah, well, so what happened during the TMDL, to be clear, so EPA was in charge of doing the TMDL, right? That's their job. They modeled, so at that time, let me just give you a little history of how this came about. So we knew that the TMDL was getting pressured. And so we said, we're going to have to change, right? We know this doesn't work for agriculture as it exists today. And so we created something called an ag working group. I hired an outside consultant called, every size farm and every type of farm that I could think of as the best mix of people and said, come sit in a room and let's figure this out. And we basically said, we need new regulations that are going to work for all of you. So what are your ideas? And we said, we're not sure we're going to listen, right? Like, but we can't do this without hearing, right? So they couldn't come up with like, we want to do nothing or whatever, right? They knew, and it was really nice. They were actually sitting at the table and they understood the charge, right? And they took it very seriously and they came up with really good ideas, actually. And so it was a very cool experience professionally because, to make regulations with the people and then go through a whole public process and talk about those regulations with people. We did over 90 meetings on the revised RAPs. We brought that ag working group report to this body, and this body took a bunch of those ideas, right? Took testimony, did all that, and said, that's what we want you to put in your rules. And so they put that in statute. And so by the time we were all done with all of this, we had actually achieved like a farmer group appreciating and understanding what they had to do and, excited to do it. Excited maybe not the right word, but, they were willing and understanding of why they had to do it and the practices seemed reasonable. So what EPA did, once you all put it into the statute to say like this is going to be the new law, they were able to then say, okay, let's run a model, right? If we figure out if you're going to do X, Y, and Z, Agency of Ag, and we put that in, does it make the TMDL work? And they decided it did, right? There were a few extra things we had to do in Missisquoi and South Lake. And so we figured those terms out and figured that. But then they said, if you do these things, it should work. So we were able to come up with it. And they tested it and it passed.
Mike.
I just wonder, since the statute prioritizing the regions has been around for a long time, and there's competition for this money, I'm just wondering if there's anywhere where you're seeing like, oh, the Connecticut River is really needs more resources, but we can't give it because statute says that.
Yeah, I think it's happened more on the USDA front than on the state front. And well, I mean, again, like, and the proportion of farmers, like, it's not to say that it's not that like people are not getting probably what they would like, right? But I think the proportion of farmers in each basin, if you looked at that, that would be the way to look at it, is to prorate how many farmers, how much money in each watershed, which we don't have the data that way, but I don't think it's significantly off, right? And we definitely look at people and we will actually pick up projects in the Connecticut where the USDA didn't have the resources to do those projects. And again, if you're under enforcement, that gets you up, right? So that is often too, like, we would never want someone to be in a basin that's not a priority to have a violation and just
kind of not able to.
Yeah. So we that's why we put that in there to make sure like those don't get lost in that shuffle.
Is there data? Do you have the data broken down by number of sort of? I don't know how. Is this a competitive grant application process? However the process works, is there data that says this is the number of projects that desired funding versus those that got funded and broken down by region? We
could figure that out. We don't have a data set already created other than we would look at the spreadsheet of what we did, and but we haven't put that out here to show that over time. I know, and it's tough. It is, because like the BMP program, we get a lot of applicants, but not everybody's ready to move, right? So someone's like, I know I need help. But literally sometimes the engineering is very, very challenging to figure out, how are you going to do this? Like, you've got no space to work and you've got to somehow figure it out. And so sometimes those take 2 years to really navigate. And so while they're on the docket, they're not actually ready. They're in the engineering phase. And so that program's a little hard to pinpoint, but for the most part, people who say I'm ready and I don't think we have people who are ready, willing, have it all figured out and are just sitting there empty-handed. On the SEEP program and the FAP program, that we see happen more. The SEEP program, the capital, the seal in the field, that one we get multiple, like 2-3 times the applicants than we can actually fund.
Because there's less to being ready to.
It's just you buy a piece of equipment, it's done, right? There's not all this planning and work that goes into it. And FAP is kind of the same thing. It's like, to plant a cover crop, you can just go buy seed and it's done within a year. So those are the quicker projects. But so let me show you more about this fun thing we built. So we've got instructions, right? So check that out if you want to, because it can teach you how to do things like if you notice, you asked about the practical basin and I just you pop it out and you can look at it bigger, in case the picture is too small for you to see. But you can also look at, like for instance, we were talking about tactical basins. When we look at, where those practices go, we can also look at how much phosphorus we've reduced. So this is one thing that, agriculture, since the Act 64 of 2015, we've all been trying to report every sector how much phosphorus we're reducing. And, agriculture comes up every year as 95, 96, 97% of the total reductions of the entire state is coming from farming. And that's because we have in advance built all these systems to track all this stuff. And so we have the data and information, and we built a really cool system that farmers can report into and tell us what they did voluntarily. And we can then send people who we trust, right, like UVM or the districts, to go verify that that project is in place. And then it'll get a credit in the system.
The gray here, that's no reduction?
Because there are no, so we send this data over to DEC every year, which comes in the format of this is the practice and this is where the practice was. And then they do the math. They have a tool to do phosphorus stuff. They only have it for Lake Champlain, right? Or for...
And then for Magog.
And then for Magog, yep. They only have it for Lake Champlain and then for Magog. They don't have it for the Hudson. Or the
So
Pacific
it's not that there wasn't a reduction, it's that we don't have the data.
You got it. Yeah, and it says it somewhere. Phosphorus reduction can't be estimated outside of these two basins. And that's just because they haven't built the tool, right?
So what, not knowing what 95,000 kg actually means, what does that mean? I mean, are we actually seeing a significant reduction? Are we achieving our goals here?
I think we are, but of course, it's going to take time, right? The TMDL was a 20-year plan.
I can imagine the riparians take about 20 years to fill it in.
Yeah. And and the water sampling will continue. DEC has water monitoring that they do. So they'll sample the lakes, they sample the rivers. And so they're doing constant assessment of how are the watersheds doing. And those reports come out every once in a while. So, so far, I would say, I think, I'm seeing the practices go on the ground. We're seeing, true problems you can see before your eyes get fixed.
Yeah.
But, it's gonna be until the day is done that we'll see.
So this is really interesting to me because I'm relating it to, I don't understand anything, but it's still interesting. And I'm relating it to CO2 sequestration, right? Because there are practices with a certain amount of assumption that if you practice the farming this way, you will improve soil quality, increase organic matter, right? Well, but it's still sort of, the jury's still out. So, here's another kind of program where you're doing these improvements with the assumption that it's going to make an improvement, and you're actually seeing an improvement, a measurable improvement, but it seems a little cart before the horse. It all works out, but you're like, oh, well, the riparian, it's like a junior wetland. It's going to have a filtration factor to it, theoretically. So let's try that.
Well, all these practices, the reason that we can do this is because someone has researched them, usually at the national level. USDA, Ag Research Service has been doing, farming has been going on forever, and the world has cared about how to make farm technology and improvements forever, right? Our government has invested in it. And so there's a research arm that has been at this longer than all of us have, right? And that's where they figured out, yes, an average buffer should get you this. And then we say, okay, we use that to do this math to figure it out. But, the site on the Winooski may be different than Lamoille just by the nature of where it is in the landscape. And so one might be higher or lower than that, but that's the best data and information that we have.
Can I continue?
One more question.
Okay, thank you. And then I will
love
shut
the
up.
excitement and interest. Thank you.
Okay, so this competitive model seems like maybe a little bit of an error in that there are probably locations that could be identified.
Critical source areas.
Right, where instead of actually focusing money to the loud squeaky wheel, it's clear this is an area, so you're gonna address this.
Yeah, well, so one, that's the priority ranking of the bigger watersheds, right? But then all these little watersheds within them, there are even littler watersheds.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's fields, right? We've done work. This is evolution. I've watched about 5 iterations of it in my time frame already, of how do we prioritize? What's the best way? What do we look at? And what map tools do we have to do it? And so, for instance, our inspectors they turn on a layer, all the critical source, or no, it's forget what we call it now, but it's a field evaluation layer that sets up like, oh, if your field's really sloped and if it looks like it could have erosion here based on the soil type, look at that first, right? And so it prioritizes and makes that a red field versus like a nice flat field would be a green field, just for visual. And so when we look, every time we go out and inspect, we inspect so many fields. And so we look at this layer and decide, where should I go, right? And so there's that version. There's also a version that the Lake Champlain Basin program did, which is was a really cool effort, actually. It was probably about 15 years ago now. They built this thing. It was a layer, and we pulled everybody working in the ag partnership together at the time. We made packets and folders and said, here, take these maps, go to those farms and figure out if that map is, legitimately what it says it should be. And if they need help in that field because it is right, then help them, right? And so we did this whole thing, and that was a huge boost. And it helped because the USDA had all the money at the time to be able to do that work. So there's various types, and that's what we try and look at that stuff.
But the competitive grant model doesn't really fit into that.
Well, I mean, again, the majority of our money is going to those production area practices, which isn't necessarily like a field, like that's hard to prioritize. There's not really spatial tools to do that really well. Really, that's a matter of just management and how your infrastructure is built. But the landscape stuff, we have efforts where we go through and say, like, if you're in the St. Albans strategic water set, like we want to make sure that we address that. So we do get priority areas, and they evolve over time for sure. But right now, like Missisquoi and South Lake are areas that we try and focus on. So we keep it a little bit broader, but we try not to get down to the field specific basis necessarily all the time in that program, because usually we're giving a grant for 100, 200 acres on multiple fields on a farm. Like they want to just do their whole farm, which is better than just doing one field, right? So we wouldn't want to exclude all the other fields at the loss of having.
I've got two questions just here. The reason we're not, tell me if this is correct, the reason we're not measuring phosphorus in the other two basins is we're not required to, or there's not an issue there with load.
Connecticut has a nitrogen TMDL.
Yep.
And Hudson doesn't, I don't think it falls into any TMDL.
So it's a relatively healthy body of water.
Up here, I think, my opinion is, but it goes all the way down through
Right.
to Long Island Sound.
Yeah.
In Long Island Sound, there's issues with nitrogen in Long Island Sound, which is why.
Someone over the last few weeks from somewhere told us that the Connecticut they're working up. They address it from the sound up, and so
That's right.
Yeah. Well, there's so much population, right? Like the density. But so there's no need to develop a phosphorus pool because there isn't a phosphorus impairment
Okay.
for that area.
And then you mentioned 20-year plan, and just in terms of, this is a long-term plan. And I don't know exactly how many years we are into it, but we'll get to 20 years at some point. And what happens then?
Well, let me say this. The first plan was long too, and we thought we'd get to the end of that, but there was an intervening environmental desire to revise it. So I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know if we'll reach that 20-year goal or not.
But I guess my question maybe should be, is the sort of the sense or intent that we'll get to a point, whether it's 20 years or at some point where we don't need these practices, or we won't need to be something?
I don't know that, like, a lot of these practices are annual practices that need to be done every year, right? So there will, not all of them, but, there's a mix. You're not going to be able to just stop and be like, we're static, we're great. But, the modeling, to your point, is like, we use the best information we can. We have tried and tested it, and we're implementing the projects. We're keeping track of the projects, and then we're doing this math with it. Again, EPA did their own math ahead of time and said that they thought that if we did all those things that we said that we're actively doing, it would all work, right? So it's an estimate for sure. And hopefully we get to the end and we realize, the water quality, because the end goal was that the water quality value, the amount of phosphorus that should be in Missisquoi Bay, would hit the target of what below that there should not be algae blooms. So we'll keep doing exactly what we're supposed to do. And I think farmers have shown that they're willing to do it all and engaged. And hopefully Everybody was right.
Yeah, good. I think we should think about starting to wrap up just for the afternoon. So doesn't mean, I'm not saying stop, but if there's a good point that you're thinking, yeah, let's get to there,
Yeah.
we can wrap up
Let me
anytime.
just flip through a couple pages real quick. So
Mike, did you want to jump in?
I was just gonna say to your question on the phosphorus reductions page, I was just looking through it, it's almost 100% of those practices are annual practices. It's
a fair
like
amount.
cover crop and,
Well, and because we can't necessarily track for all the production area practices yet, we still need information and technology to be able to come up with those
right.
practices.
So it's not like 20 years and we don't have it anymore, it's like 20 years and enough of the land is doing this every year that.
We'll be able to, yeah. Good.
We may be adding farmland too if we do this 30 by 30 thing, so.
Well, that's just it. You know, the other factors that are all pushing on everything, like we couldn't have predicted those, 20 years prior. But I just want to show you, so the people that we work with, like the conservation district, a lot of this is done by those folks and by us, but just, one of the things we wanted to track was how much we do outreach with people. So you can take a look at that. And again, you can click any of these filters, right? And just be like, oh, what's it like in 2016? But just remember, unclick it to go back to the whole statewide. You can see, so technical visits, I told you we had engineers. We go out and do, you can see we've done almost 4,000 technical visits since 2018. We're out there a lot trying to help people fix things. In addition, the districts and people we give those statewide grants to, we make them report to us if they went to a farm and helped with technical assistance. That's part of their grant agreement, is to tell us that they did, so that way we can track that data. And you can see it all by farm size here. You can see how much of the work. So UVM and the districts do about a quarter of the work each.
Do a lot of small farm visits.
We do a lot of small farm visits. We have two categories of small farms. This is 50 dairy cow. It's more than dairy cows, but again, I often just talk in dairy because it makes sense to everybody. But this is 50 to 199 dairy cows, and then below that is this SFO group. This group is often turkeys, chickens, llamas, it's everything. SFO. But typically, once you get to CSFO, MFO, and LFO, you're into dairy for the most part. But we definitely have beef and stuff like that. But you can kind of see like the technical assistance programs we do. You can also see like the majority of it is either our BMP program or Ag CWIP. And Ag CWIP is the partners, money moving to the partners who go do the work. So most of it is just, the people who are working with farms in the ag partnership. Then you can look at, how many acres of production areas we've inspected. So we map the size of the production area. So, over 10,000 acres since 2019, which is a significant amount of area that we look at to make sure it's compliant or not compliant. You can check it out by farm size. If you look at, one thing to look at is, so it looks like, the number inspected by farm size looks way big. And I told you we only have about 39 small farms. But that's because a large farm might have 9 different farms that are, and we go to every one of the ones that they operate.
All that one farm.
It's one permit, but for this is looking at every single facility, is how we call them facilities. And multiple facilities might be under one permit. And so we keep track of each facility that we walked around and did and our staff walk around every piece of infrastructure to make sure it's not having some leak somewhere. And so anyway, so you can kind of see that view.
Representative Cole, is that a question?
Yeah, when you say compliant, and a couple of the last slides are just looking at compliance, are you talking about like total maximum daily load? Or are you talking about what does compliance entail entirely?
It's a whole body that we didn't even get into. So we have the required ag practices.
Yeah.
So the RAP. So those are the non-point source rules.
Okay.
And then MFO and LFO are the two that sort of are the comparable to the CAFO, but all farms have to follow the RAP, the required ag practices. And so this compliance is either with those rules, the RAPs, the MFO, or the LFO. So, and this is only in the production area. This is not in the crop fields. And so there's been a lot of talk too about this morning in Senate Ag, about the 70%, right? So 70% of these are showing up as compliant and 30% are not. And one of the things to explain about that 30%, because I think the natural reaction is like, that's really high. But remember, Our stuff is about preventing anything from happening, so you get in trouble for not even preventing. So a lot of that is not actually water quality violations. It's not like pollution is happening but we're saying there's this potential for pollution to happen, you need to stop. And so the other piece of that is that if in a production area, you might have the bunk, like typically a production area will have like 15 assets. So bunks, manure pit, the treatment area for potentially both of those, barnyards. We walk around everything. And if any one of those is not being managed the way we think it should be managed, it gets written up. And if it gets written up, the whole production area said that it's not compliant. So you could be doing really good. Like one thing is like, there are times, right? Like especially we talk about someone who doesn't have enough storage, right? And if they're more often, it's not that they necessarily don't have enough storage, but they didn't have enough money to empty their storage, right? And we show up and the pit is really full. And we're like, that's a violation because you have to have that 12 inches or 18 inches, depending on the type of manure pit it is, of freeboard, open space. And so if you use that open space, we're going to tell you you're in violation and hold you accountable. It may never overtop, right? You may be able to finally get someone in and deal with it. But so it had no actual risk to water, but it's going to come up as non-compliant. So, just because there's 30% non-compliance doesn't mean that all farms are polluting at that 30%.
And maybe to just follow up on that. So when a farm is given this notice that they did not come into compliance, is it paired with sort of maybe resources for how, like grants they can apply to help cover these? Because I know cost is a big part maybe.
Yeah, so our general enforcement process, real quick, and I'll flip to the enforcement page, I'm sure you've already seen. We send people a warning. We call it a corrective action letter. We say, hey, you're on notice, you got an issue. You have 30 days to tell us how you're going to fix it. Mm-hmm. And we decide if it's good, right? So they might respond to us and we might say, no, inadequate, try again, and do that until we get it right. And then they have to implement whatever they said they did by the times they said they would do it. And we would go and inspect to make sure that they do that. That's majority of our stuff that we do is that corrective action letter, farms fixing it. And most people are really good about it. If when we showed up to check off that they were done and they hadn't done it, they would go to a penalty usually, right? And then that usually gets their attention, right? And then they'll make it done if that's what they needed. If they didn't follow that, then we could, in essence, basically put them in final order and we could file that with the court if we wanted to. Typically farms, like we talked about the Attorney General's office in the beginning, farms that keep getting into that space are the ones that usually are over there because they just keep pushing. But majority of the farms, one of the cool things I think it's good because it saves time, energy, and resources all the way around is that the Agency of Ag can actually sort of be like a little court, right? We have administrative abilities in the enforcement realm. So we can send a farm a penalty. Like one difference between A&R and Ag, we both can send a farm a penalty. But when A&R does it, often that conversation could end up with the court. So where Ag, they can come in, they can call for a pre-hearing, we can talk and we can settle it. What A&R does is they file that and say, this is a public matter, and when the AOD is finalized, it's all finalized through the court. So we can have conversations, we can decide if we like or don't like the response that we get. The farmer can always appeal and say, I don't agree with the Secretary of Ag. And they can always go to court, but it's step 2, right? So you just don't have to come right in with lawyers and dealing with all that stuff. We can actually negotiate it and figure it out. And to date, I haven't had to go to court for a farm that has been in that administrative enforcement office. Anything we've referred to the Attorney General's office, we've got a few cases over there for sure, but farms are usually, they'll do it once you tell them they need to do it.
Representative Rice, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, is there any more sort of nimble, like emergency assistance resource for, in the case where, say, you arrive at a farm for an inspection and the tank is too full because they can't afford to empty it?
Yeah, there's sort of a balance there where it's like, it's not the government's job to take care of people who don't manage their stuff, right? But when it starts to harm public health or the environment in a negative way, we do have the ability to step in. But usually what we'll do in a situation like that, well, if it's overtopping and getting to water, it goes over to A&R, right? But for us, what really brought it up was a case a couple of years ago where there's like these somebody just left the farm and left the animals, right? And then they passed away and nobody was composting them. And it was just like, it was concerning. It was like, and there was nobody there. There was no money to be able to like, the animals needed to get gathered together and put into a compost pile, and it all needed to be managed appropriately. But how? Who's going to do that, right? It's like, and so, and a lot of it is police. You know, they have the jurisdiction at that point because it becomes animal welfare and other, you know, treating animals and all that kind of stuff. So, but we came to the legislature following that and said, look, can you guys give us the ability to use some of the money in our budget to be able to step in and say, you know, hey, excavator down the road, can you come over here? Hey, you with all this sawdust, can you bring that over here? We will pay for it. We will get it done. And then we will, once, you know, the police are going to go after the person that left, we would then get involved in that as well and say, we need the money back, right? So we got that ability to do that, to be able to go back and to take action, use the money from our budget, but then ask for the money back through legal proceedings.
But there's not a sort of
No.
quick acting emergency assistance program for a farmer who isn't out of compliance because they, you know, desire to be or don't care about the proper process, but for some financial reason couldn't complete their requirement.
Yeah, I mean,
Goes to the outside.
like an example, the worst example is obviously people who don't have the money to empty their manure storage and it's actively overtopping.
And so
Again,
that to me, it sounds like the fact that what happens is it gets passed from ag to A&R is actually the opposite of like a nimble, fast acting solution.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you, but they have to own up to the water quality violation, right? Like that's not something you just get a pass at. So A&R is going to enforce that. I will say as an agency, one of the things we try and do is we try to be that nimble space in between where we have the ability to. Telling the farmer to go find magic money is not something we can do. Taking it out of our budget to go do it is something we can do, but what we, you know, and I explain that to you if it's harming the health and environment. But usually what I will do is call other farms, call other custom manure applicators, call other people and say, can you help? So if we back up to spreading exemptions, when someone calls me and says, I need a spreading exemption, I give them a really hard time, first off, right? But who did you call? What resources do you, because there's probably another storage you can take it to. So we try and get there before storage is overtopping, if we know about it, and move that to someplace else. And, you know, sometimes what you learn is socially, they've burned all their bridges and no one's going to take their material because it costs money to then land apply it. But sometimes they're good farmers that people have known years and they're just, you know, a little older or whatever it is. And there's a sympathetic ear in the community that says, I'll take care of it. Like, we'll just bring it to my farm. Like, I know he's dealing with X, Y, or Z in his family and, you know, I got this. So we definitely try to connect if we can with other people to see if people will help. Meanwhile, it's at A&R, right? Like, but if we can find a solution to the problem, we will try and do that. It's so rare, but that's generally the nature of our agency is we want to find a solution. And if we have the means that we can try and make that happen, we will.
Well, would that be a good place to wrap up?
Yeah, sure. I love your enthusiasm, really. And I hope you poke around with this and if you have questions in the future.
It's interesting side.
And it'll adapt. This will be our format. We'll keep it up as we get more information. And, you know, some of the things you'll see, like if you look at that cover cropping, the investment, you know, this number is incomplete. It'll go up because the year hasn't really ended for us on some of the reporting that we get back. So you'll see it change over time, but hopefully it'll be a useful interface for people to understand what we're doing and not feel that we're not being as transparent as we possibly could.
It's just information that you did say in the past would have been printed and forwarded.
And this much, I mean, we didn't try and, this is a lot. There's a lot here because you can sort it by multiple years and go back in time and you can look at individual programs. The paper reports could never do that, right? They would have been way too long.
Right.
So it really would have been higher level aggregation of information.
I look forward to looking through it.
Yeah. So thank you. And again, if you have questions, like, you know, we do water quality, we do technical assistance, the financial assistance that goes with that, and the regulation. So any of those questions. We also, the RAPs, the required ag practices, do some zoning work as well. we can issue variances to structure. So there's a little bit there as well in the future that we can talk about.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to see you. I like your new room too.
Bigger.
Is there a way to find this information when we're not on the webinar?
I'm still trying to navigate myself. I don't know if we've made a link off our website.
Laura sent us a link.
But I did send you a link.
Got it.
Yeah, I found it.
Yeah.
So,
I just don't know if we've put it up on our website yet. We showed Senate Ag. That was when we did our introduction with them. That was the first time we released it. So this is like the second time I've released it. So we need to get it up on our website, but I think we respectfully wanted to put it here first and
Oh, good.
then we'll get it out there. So,
And you can incorporate any feedback that you heard from us.
yeah, we're hoping to make it, we want it to be useful. If you find it not useful and you're not getting the answers you want, let us know.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.